The era of the modern World's Fair began in Britain in 1851 with what was called the Great Exhibition, or the Crystal Palace Exhibition. And there they had displays from literally all over the world. They had scientific and technological marvels in craftsmanship and in art. And one of the centerpieces and most unique of all the presentations was this large display, a machine that had thousands of moving parts. It had gears and pulleys and bells and whistles. Smoke came out. It did all sorts of things, and it was in constant motion. But the catch was, it didn't produce anything. All it did was move. It had what I call a rocking chair mind frame. There was a lot of motion, a lot of activity, but there was no productivity. Busyness without productivity is not acceptable in kingdom life. That's why, for me, it's really important that in Union Baptist Association, we do the things that really matter. We have a Great Commission responsibility, and we try and help our churches fulfill their Great Commission responsibility. And UBA has a wonderful legacy. Over 174 years ago. In fact, this October, we will celebrate the 175th anniversary of Union Baptist Association. Over 174 years ago, Union Baptist Association began. A small group of folks gathered not too far from here over in Brenham, and they formed the association. Because they said, we are the mission field. This was not Texas yet. This was not a state yet. We were the mission frontier. And they said a great work is needed, so they formed the association to begin to mobilize churches to do the work that needed to be done in reaching the community with Christ. Over the years, UBA has done some tremendous things. Last summer, I spent a lot of time preparing for this year by reading the history, including some of the original documents for Union Baptist Association. Most folks probably don't know, we were instrumental in the formation of Baylor University. UBA started Baylor University. We also started Houston Baptist University. We're the only association that I know of that is responsible for the formation of 2 institutions of higher learning. We helped start the first statewide Baptist paper, and we're instrumental in the formation of the first state convention. We helped start Memorial Hospital, as well as the Star of Hope and a number of other entities through the years. The first full-time student worker was employed here in Houston. It was a cooperative venture with South Main Baptist Church. We're going to spend the year highlighting some of the history of Union Baptist Association, and we're going to celebrate in October the work that we've done and the future that we have. But it's not enough to tell you about the history of Union Baptist Association if we're not doing a great work right now. About 5 years ago, we began a process of looking at ourselves and seeing what we needed to do in order to do a more effective job. And we concluded that the Great Commission is still our marching orders. And we asked, what can we do? Out of all the things that we could do, what's the most important work that the association can play in today's culture? And we decided, and we framed it this way, that our task is to mobilize churches to take on lostness. Now, 2 questions arise from that. One is, what do we do to mobilize churches to take on lostness? And secondly, how are we doing when it comes to mobilizing churches to take on lostness? And I can answer the first question for you, but I need your help in answering the second question. First question, what do we do? Well, I thought back over all the things that we did as an associational office in 2014. I thought of the conferences that we had, the seminars, the consulting, the teaching, the training. I thought of all the things we put on our website and wondered how in the world do we take and analyze all of that stuff to really say, are we mobilizing churches to take on lostness? Are we being helpful? Does what we do matter? The more I thought about it, the more I began to ask the question, all right, what really does it mean for us to mobilize churches to take on lostness? Let me just kind of unpack that for you, because this serves as kind of the guiding directional phrase for UBA. Lostness. I realize that's not a popular word today. There are folks who much prefer to use phrases like moving away from God, or far from God, or near to God. The idea of lostness and lost and saved seems too dichotomous. It's too much like you're in or you're out, and they really struggle with that. The only trouble that I have with all these other descriptions is the Bible refers to us as lost or saved. And, you know, I just happen maybe to be old-fashioned, but I'm going to be comfortable just being biblical. I realize it's not cool to use phrases like this, but I might as well go ahead and confess. Cool has never been an adjective that's been used to describe me, so I'm not really worried about that. But even though I use an old-fashioned term, we need to understand that lostness has changed. It doesn't mean the same thing it did a few years ago. And that's not a theological statement. That's a sociological statement. It used to be that the vast majority of Americans shared a worldview that was pretty consistent with the Bible. When we talked about God, we were referring to the God of the Bible. When folks said they didn't believe in God, the God they didn't believe in was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. When we spoke of sin, they were talking about violating God's laws. And for most of us here today, that worldview has not changed. But every year that goes by here in America, fewer and fewer people share that worldview. Their worldview is informed by postmodernity, by other world religions. Honor and shame is becoming the predominant worldview of folks, not just here in America, but around the world. And when I go into the little donut shop that's in our community that I was talking with Brian about in a private conversation not too long ago, when I go in there and I order a kolache or a sausage croissant, I go in and I talk to this Cambodian family. And when I meet them and I talk with them and I say something like, God bless you, as we're beginning to build that relationship, I realize when I talk about God, the God I talk about is not the God they're thinking about. Because right behind the cash register, on a little shelf, they have what is called the God shelf. And they have their gods, and the gods face the door as folks come in and face the drive-through window. So that whenever anybody comes in or drives through, those gods are protecting them, watching out over whoever comes into that store. When I talk about God, they don't think about the God that I'm talking about. They don't understand the God of the Bible. One of the things that I think we're trying to help our churches understand is how much the world is changing and how the things that we used to do 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, they're not adequate for the world in which we live today. So we held a variety of conferences last year. And we began to talk more and more about worldviews and the various worldviews that people hold. And we're trying to inform and help our churches understand not just that the world is different, but how the world is different. We mobilize churches to take on lostness, and our understanding of lostness is changing. But we mobilize churches, and our understanding of churches has to change too. I really do believe in the church. I believe the church is the hope of the world. I believe that the church is one of two institutions, sacred institutions, established and ordained by God, the family and the church. And aside from the family, I really believe that the most important institution in society is a biblically based, really healthy fully functioning church. I believe there you can have your spiritual, emotional, physical, relational needs met. I believe in the church. And I think one of the most important things that we can do as an association is to help strengthen and start new churches. Amen to what you said a minute ago, Bryant. But when most of us think about church, the church that we think about is just like this. It's the traditional institutional church. It's the one that probably most of us came from and will go to worship in this Sunday. But our research has shown us, and I've shared it with you before, when we started doing the math, here's what we discovered. We cannot buy enough land, build enough buildings, and train enough people and pay them to reach this city with the gospel of Christ if the only kind of church we think about is the traditional church. That's why 15 years ago we began to look at what God was doing around the world. And we realized that church planting movements were happening around the world, and the way God was reaching the masses of people was through the church, but it wasn't the traditional church. It was the organic, the simple, the house church. And so we began to encourage more and more in that direction, saying we've got to think differently. And we began to teach and to train people in how to use the house church or the organic church model. And immediately there was resistance. There was all sorts of concern because it didn't fit into our paradigms of what church was. But we leaned into that and we stayed with that. And you know what? Now all across our city, house churches are being formed. They're being formed in communities that might not be reached otherwise, in immigrant communities, and in the prison population. If you got a chance to go over and hear them talk about what's going on, churches are being formed, folks are being trained, and these people are going to go into some of the most difficult communities in our city and reach others with the gospel of Jesus Christ through organic, simpler house churches. But that's not enough. Not everyone's going to be comfortable in a traditional church. Not everyone's going to be reached through the house church. That's why we began to look again at what's going on in the world, and we realized there's another model out there. I call it the cell celebration model. It's kind of a hybrid between the organic church and the traditional church. It's kind of a blend of those two. And the largest churches in the world, churches in Asia, churches in Africa, churches in Latin America, are cell celebration churches. That's not a model that's being used here in the United States. But we began to research it, and we found that a leading authority on that style of church lives right here in Houston, a retired missionary, Dr. Ralph Neighbor. And so we turned to Dr. Neighbor and we said, train us. You're the expert. Train us. And we turned to Campo Londoño, and Campo studied this kind of church in Latin America. And as he studied it, we said, take this, learn about it, train leaders. The Hispanic culture seems to be the one most open to it. Let's figure out how we can do this. And I really do believe that with these three models of church, they're like the primary colors. You can take the three primary colors, blend them together, and have millions of colors. These three we can blend together to develop the kinds of churches that we need to reach this city with the gospel of Christ. Now, I say all of that, but I got to tell you, I love the traditional church. I really do. I love what we do. I love the choirs. I love the programs. I love the traditional church. I love hamburgers too. And if the only thing I ate was hamburgers, I would not have a well-balanced diet and I would not be a healthy person. And if the only thing we can do to reach people with the gospel of Christ is think in a narrow, restricted paradigm of the traditional church, we'll never reach our city with the gospel of Christ. So we have to continue to lean in. And Brian, I really do hope we are on the cutting edge. I hope that at some point in the future, not only will house church be well accepted and widespread across our country, but the cell celebration model will as well. Lostness is changing. A church needs to change. It's changing more slowly, but it needs to change. But our sense of what it means to be mobilized needs to be changed as well. You know, when I first started at Union Baptist Association, if we said mobilize churches to take on lostness, we would have said, That means hold a training clinic and invite people to come and learn evangelism explosion, witness involvement now, 4 spiritual laws. Go back to your church and you bring people into your church and you train them to go out and go door to door in their community and knock on doors and share the gospel. That's what it meant to mobilize churches, to take on lostness. Or have a great big revival. That's how we mobilize churches, to take on lostness. You know what? The world has changed. It really has. Most of us don't buy things from door-to-door salesmen anymore. Technology's changed all that. The way we communicate, the way we connect has changed. And the way we communicate and the way we connect has to change for the church as well. So we did lots of conferences last year trying to train folks to think about the new generation, the rising generation, how they connect, how we use technology, how the website is now the front door of the church. We tried to help our churches with this whole high-tech era, but you know, high-tech is not enough. David has talked about high touch all morning. And high-tech needs high touch. That's why in 2013 we started Loving Houston. We mobilized volunteers to go into the community and in the community there to live out the love of Christ. Why? Why do we do that? The answer is really simple. It's because most folks in our society think the church is entirely irrelevant. They don't think the church makes a difference in our world. And by extension, if the church doesn't make a difference, the gospel message doesn't make a difference. But when we sent folks into communities to love on those folks, to begin to make a difference, when we take Loving Houston and we say we need to go into schools and begin to connect with schools and go in to make a difference, when we do it in the prison ministry, when we do it through partnerships like with Big Brothers and Big Sisters and all the various communities, we're trying to get the church to go into the community, to show the relevance of the church to the world in which we live. And by extension, as the church is relevant, the gospel is relevant, and people become open to the gospel. David talked about how many touches they had. But did you hear the last part? After touching again and again and again, I baptized this one, I baptized that one, this one's daughter, that one's wife. I'm going to baptize this one. These folks are being reached. So when we talk about mobilizing churches, we're talking about getting them outside of the church, not just through technology, but through hands-on ministry in the local community. That's why we did this morning. That's why we held up what David is doing as an example. That's why we go out seeking partners to say, who can we partner with to get into the community to reach them with the gospel of Christ? Those are the things that we're doing. But the question is it working? Does what we are doing make a difference? Now, I'll be honest. We're doing what we do because I think it's going to make a difference. But the truth is, we need metrics to know. When I came to Houston in 1988, Houston was a rapidly growing city. The city was growing like that, and when the research was done, we found out that Baptist churches were growing like that. We'd flatlined, we were level, which meant every year that went by, the gap was getting wider and wider between the church and the community. And so, under Jim Harrington's leadership, we began to look at ourselves. We changed some of our personnel. We changed some of our program. We changed some of our direction. And you know what? It began to make a difference. We began to see that gap closed. And for a good while, toward the end of the 90s and the first part of the new century, We were growing faster than the population. But then something happened. And what happened is actually kind of a combination of things. Because it seemed like we had flatlined. If you began to look, we saw tremendous progress. We more than doubled the number of folks that were being baptized from a number of years ago. The city kept growing, but suddenly our numbers were flatlining. And it may be the result of what we're doing, but I suspect it could largely be the result of what we're not doing. Let me tell you what I mean. Every year, we ask churches to complete something that's called the Annual Church Profile, the ACP. And we ask churches to fill that out, and it tells us how many members you've got, how many folks you've baptized, what your attendance is. It gives a statistical profile of your church. And we ask you every year, give us a snapshot. Tell us what happened last year. And for the longest time, it was just understood that if you were a Baptist church, that's what you did. And those of us that have been in Baptist life for a long time know that that's what you always did. And the association collected them, and they gave us a statistical profile of the work that we're doing. But things have changed. A lot of the churches that we start today don't even have Baptist in the name. In fact, we've had pastors that have come to some of our churches that were a part of Union Baptist Association, and they didn't even realize they were coming to pastor a Baptist church. I mean, it's just different today. And you know what else is different? Folks don't like turning in those profiles because they just don't see it as part of their culture. And more of our churches, and they've come in with other backgrounds. A lot of our African American churches, that's not part of their culture. Some of our Asian churches, that's not part of their culture. And you know what? They're not used to doing things like that. So we went from an association where back in the 90s, almost every church reported at the end of the year what they had done. We're 3 times larger than we were then. And you know what? We have about the same number of churches reporting now than we did during the 90s. Only 1 out of 3 churches will respond and say, this is what we did last year. Now, we're starting churches. Satellite churches are being formed. Lots of other things are happening. And I really do believe we are doing a better job than we've ever done before, but statistically, I can't prove it because folks just aren't responding. We are working harder than we have ever worked before to get churches to turn in their annual church profile. A ministry like Trinity Pines, Mission Centers, they've got their data. They can see what they're doing. We have to count on you for that kind of data. And unfortunately, some of the answers that we receive are like we did from one church the other day. Nope, I'm not telling. We're not going to give you any information on us. Now, folks, we don't judge. We're not doing it for a sense of judging you as to whether or not you're doing good or bad. We're just trying to get a picture of what we are doing corporatively to reach the city with the gospel of Christ. We need to know, is what we are doing working? And if it's not working, we'll change. But we need that kind of feedback from you all. So what can you do? Well, if only 1 out of 3 churches so far basically is reporting, if you haven't reported, I sure would ask you to please do that. Whether you're a pastor or a church leader, find out if you haven't. Check with our office. Somebody's going to give you a call. Somebody's going to ask you for that information. And please respond. We live in the tension between an unchanging responsibility in an ever-changing cultural context. What we do isn't easy, and we need your help trying to figure out if what we're doing is working. When Union Baptist Association began 174 years ago, the people who formed the association said, "We are the mission field." And they were. Texas was not a state. The United States stopped basically at the Mississippi River. We weren't a state yet. We were the mission field. And they said, we've got to join together to reach this mission field with the gospel of Christ. That was true 174 years ago. It is more true now than it's ever been. When they said that, Texas wasn't a state, and the total population of Houston was less than the Sunday morning worship attendance in this church this past week. But they knew they were the mission field. And folks, that's more true today. And it is more true today that we need a great work here. And I need your help to figure out how well we're doing. So I know, good sermons usually end with invitations. All those who need to repent and turn in your ACP, please come forward. We'll get that kind of invitation. But you know what? It's important. And in all the years I've done this job, I've never done anything like this to say, please help us. But we need that information.